From Raleigh, North Carolina, this is Democracy Now!
Today is May 1st, and we all know that immigrant rights are worker rights. No more deportations, no more breaking families. We are here, and we are going to stay. I'm going to fight because we work really hard.
Millions of workers take to the streets to mark May Day, International Workers' Day. We'll hear voices from the streets of New York and speak to an immigrant rights organizer here in Raleigh. Then the ACLU mounts a new fight to overturn the North Carolina bill that replaced the anti-trans bill known as HB 2. We'll also look at the political crisis here in the Tar Heel state after Republican lawmakers waged a legislative coup against the state's Democratic governor. Is North Carolina still a democracy? And we'll look at how a group of African-American residents in North Carolina are fighting back against factory hog farms that spray liquid manure on their communities.
We don't open the doors or the windows, but the odor still comes in. It takes your breath away. Then you start gagging, you get headaches.
I shut my hog operation down, and I got out of it. And I just couldn't do another person that way to make them smell that.
Coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Around the world, millions of workers took to the streets Monday for May Day, also known as International Workers' Day. This year in California, tens of thousands of people marched in the Bay Area as immigrant workers refused to go to work and students walked out of class. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, more than 30,000 people marched to demand the governor fire Milwaukee County Sheriff Dave Clark, block anti-immigrant legislation, and return driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants. At least 140 businesses were shut down across Milwaukee. In Texas, 24 people were arrested, including Austin City Council member Gregorio Casar, after an 8-hour sit-in at the office of Texas Governor Greg Abbott in protest of anti-immigrant bill SB 4. This is Julianne Nitsch.
I'm a fifth-generation Texan, and my family has served this country for a very long time. We didn't serve, and we didn't come to this country to flee persecution so that we could live in a country where people are stopped, detained, and abused because of the color of their skin. SB 4 is disgusting. It's racist. All law enforcement officers are against it, and the only reason why these politicians are pushing it is so that they can get money from a fringe racist constituency, and they have to be stopped.
In many cities and rural areas, some immigrants launched a one-day work strike, including in Homestead, Florida, where farm workers refused to work and instead marched to City Hall. Monday's immigrant-led protests came as newly released data from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, known as ICE, shows nearly half of the 675 immigrants arrested in ICE raids in February had either low-level driving convictions or no criminal record at all. In Portland, Oregon, police arrested at least 25 protesters Monday as some demonstrators hurled paint and Pepsi cans at the police. The soda cans were a reference to a Pepsi ad featuring Kendall Jenner, in which she's portrayed as a hero after diffusing tensions between protesters and police by offering a cop a can of Pepsi. Meanwhile, in Puerto Rico, thousands of protesters blocked traffic and marched downtown to protest austerity measures imposed by the Federal Fiscal Control Board.
We are repudiating the measures taken by the government of Puerto Rico and the Federal Fiscal Control Board against the workers and those measures they hope to take against workers and the rest of the country.
May Day protests were also held worldwide, including in France, Kenya, Indonesia, South Korea, Russia, and in Turkey, where more than 70 people were arrested in Istanbul. We'll have more voices from the May Day protests in the streets of New York after headlines. In news on Syria, Human Rights Watch says Syrian government forces have used chemical nerve agents such as sarin gas in attacks at least 4 times in recent months, including in the April attack on a town that killed 86 people, including dozens of children. Human Rights Watch also says new evidence, including photos and videos of weapon remnants, suggests the April attack came from a Soviet-made airdrop chemical bomb specifically designed to deliver sarin. One of the other attacks on December 12th reportedly killed 64 people. The Syrian government denies using chemical weapons, including in the April attack. Meanwhile, U.S.-led coalition airstrikes continue in Syria. The journalistic monitoring group Air Wars says these airstrikes reportedly killed at least 24 civilians in the final week of April in and around Raqqa. U.S.-led coalition airstrikes also continue in Mosul, Iraq, where dozens of civilians were killed by airstrikes launched by the coalition or the U.S.-backed Iraqi army in the final week of April. In Afghanistan, more civilians died last year amidst the ongoing war than at any time since the United Nations began keeping records in 2009. At least 11,418 civilians died in 2016. Another 660,000 Afghans fled their homes, the highest number of displacements on record. This comes as the White House is considering a plan to deploy an additional 5,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. CIA Director Mike Pompeo visited Seoul, South Korea Monday amidst rising tensions between the U.S. and North Korea. His visit comes as the THAAD missile defense system installed by the U.S. and South Korea is now operational. On Monday, President Trump said he'd be honored to meet North Korean President Kim Jong-un. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer later tried to walk back the president's comments, saying, quote, "Clearly the conditions are not there right now," unquote. Meanwhile, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has said he might be too busy to accept President Trump's invitation to the White House. Human rights activists criticized the invitation, saying it condones the thousands of extrajudicial killings in the Philippines since Duterte launched his so-called war on drugs. The White House is pushing for a vote on a new Republican plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, even as widespread questions about the plan remain, including whether President Trump understands it. On Monday, President Trump reiterated his claim that the Republican bill would guarantee coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. In fact, on Saturday, Republican lawmakers struck a deal that would not protect people with pre-existing conditions, instead allowing insurers to charge them significantly higher premiums. The White House is pushing for a vote as early as Wednesday, even though a number of Republicans came out against the legislation on Monday. In one of his latest interviews, President Trump sparked confusion and ridicule by questioning why exactly the Civil War was fought and suggesting former President Andrew Jackson could have averted the war itself had he not been dead for 16 years by the time it began.
I mean, had Andrew Jackson been a little bit later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart, and he was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said, there's no reason for this. People don't realize, you know, the Civil War, you think about it, why? People don't ask that question. But why was there the Civil War? Why could that one not have been worked out?
The Civil War was fought over the expansion of slavery in the United States. President Jackson was a slaveholder. Princeton University history professor Julian Zelizer said Trump's comments were the, quote, height of inaccurate historical revisionism, unquote. Trump later doubled down on his statements, tweeting on Monday night, quote, President Andrew Jackson, who died 16 years before the Civil War started, saw it coming and was angry, would never have let it happen, unquote. Fox News has ousted co-president Bill Shine as part of the continued fallout over revelations about sexual harassment at the network. Shine worked closely with former chairman Roger Ailes, who was ousted over the summer after more than 20 women accused him of sexual harassment and professional retaliation. Fox's former top anchor, Bill O'Reilly, has also been ousted amidst sexual harassment accusations. On Monday, however, Fox promoted longtime executive Suzanne Scott, who's been accused in multiple lawsuits of working to cover up Ailes' sexual harassment. In Houston, Texas, a federal judge has ordered Harris County to stop imprisoning people on misdemeanor charges because they can't pay bail, after ruling the bail system is unconstitutional and discriminates against poor defendants. Harris County is the third largest county jail system in the United States. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, a jury's recommended bringing criminal charges against 7 Milwaukee County jailers who denied 38-year-old Terrell Thomas water for 7 days in a solitary confinement jail cell. Thomas died from extreme dehydration on April 24, 2016. In Minneapolis, a man has been sentenced to 15 years in prison after shooting and wounding 5 Black Lives Matter protesters in 2015 at an occupation at a police precinct over the police killing of Jamar Clark. Prosecutors say 25-year-old Alan Scarcella sent a series of racist texts to friends in the months leading up to his decision to drive over to the protest camp, put on a mask, and shoot 5 of the demonstrators. Meanwhile, in Texas, family and friends are mourning the death of 15-year-old Jordan Edwards, who was shot in the head by a police officer in a suburb of Dallas on Saturday. The Balch Springs Police Department had initially claimed the officers opened fire while the car carrying the high school freshman was reversing toward the police car. But in fact, on Monday, the police chief admitted the police officer opened fire while the car was actually moving forward, away from the police. In Washington, D.C., prosecutors have filed a slew of additional felony and misdemeanor charges against more than 200 people who were arrested at protests during President Trump's inauguration, January 20th. While most of the protesters were already charged with felony rioting, the new charges also include inciting or urging to riot, conspiracy to riot, and multiple counts of destruction of property. The legal support group Defend J20 Resistance says the new charges mean protesters are now facing up to 75 years in prison. And in New York City, author and editor Jean Stein has died after she took her own life on Sunday. She was 83 years old. The former editor of the Paris Review, Stein was well known for writing best-selling oral histories, her latest, West of Eden, An American Place, about MCA, the Music Corporation of America, which is now NBC Universal. MCA was founded by her father, Jules Stein. Stein is survived by her daughters, Katrina vanden Heuvel, publisher of The Nation, and actress Wendy vanden Heuvel. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Around the world, millions of workers took to the streets Monday for May Day, also known as International Workers' Day. In the United States, the marches were led by immigrant workers and their allies, drawing comparisons to the massive May Day 2006, when millions of immigrants protested nationwide. A series of protests were held in New York. The first of the day's protests was a picket line outside B&H Photo Video, the nation's largest independent retailer of photo and video equipment. Hundreds of B&H workers staged a one-day strike to oppose a plan to relocate more than 300 jobs from Brooklyn to New Jersey. Democracy Now!'s Tarina Nadura, John Hamilton, and Andre Lewis filed this report.
It's going down. New York is a union town.
My name is Armando Giron, and I've been working at B&H for 9 years now. We are very concerned because the company wants to move to New Jersey, and the majority of my coworkers and I live here in New York, in the Bronx, Queens, and in Brooklyn.
Aquí en el Bronx, Queens, y en Brooklyn.
We are fighting here to stop the company from moving, because if they do so, we, more than 300 employees, will be put out on the streets. They are planning to move to a place far, far away, where there's no transportation.
I'm Hector Figueroa, president of Local 32BJ. Here is the thing. Today is May 1st, and we all know that immigrant rights are worker rights. No more deportations, no more breaking families. We are here and we are going to stay. I'm going to fight because we work really hard. We feed the American public. We take care of their children. We clean the offices. We tend to the seniors. We are the ones who are making America strong, and we are here to stay. What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now! What do we want? Justice! What do we want it? Now! If we don't get it, shut it down! If we don't get it, shut it down!
My name is Jimena Bustamante. I am from the International Women's Strike. We are striking to reclaim the rights of all workers, but in particular of immigrant workers, and we are striking to make very clear that this city moves because of immigrant labor, and particularly because of women's immigrant labor. We believe that it's very necessary to show everyone that without their labor, this city cannot move.
So when we march today, we march and we protect one another, we keep one another safe. This is not a permitted march.
Mi nombre es Angelina Cáceres y yo trabajo para la cooperativa de Golden Steps.
My name is Angelina Cáceres and I work at the Golden Steps Cooperative, a group of immigrant women trying to make their businesses thrive and at the same time trying to help the country's economy. We are a group of women fighting to make a living, to get our families moving forward.
My name is Agunda Okeo. I'm a native New Yorker, originally from Kenya. I'm an immigrant. I'm an activist, an organizer, and I'm coming here with my friends who we co-founded a campaign called Hater Free NYC. It's a localized creative action boycott targeting the current Trump administration, including the cabinet. Think of this as a day where people can come together and recognize the history of America in a more honest sense, and the fact that workers' rights are in everyone's interest.
All right, NYU, yeah!
Bueno, mi nombre es Alejandro Olivares y mi organización es Brown Workers.
My name is Alejandro Olivares. My organization is Brand Workers. I want to send a message to Donald Trump. We come here to work. We are good people and not criminals, as he says.
La verdad, yo pienso que no es cierto
I think that is not true, and this country is a country of immigrants, built by immigrants with their work and sacrifice. I hope that his administration makes changes because the current situation is unfair for us immigrants.
Ojalá y cambie su administración porque es injusto para nosotros, todos los inmigrantes.
My name is Ann Tran. I teach at Baruch College. I'm here at May Day supporting CUNY adjuncts. Adjuncts are part-time workers in the CUNY system. We're faculty who teach. It actually could be full-time teaching, but we get paid as part-time workers. And so we are severely exploited in terms of not being able to know whether we'll have a job from semester to semester. And you can see how impossible it is to plan, paying your rent if you don't know whether you're going to have a job the next semester.
My name is Nasheen. I'm here with Drum. My message to Donald Trump. Well, you have had privilege your whole life. You've had so many privileges that we don't have, and you judge us from such a high horse. First of all, get off your high horse. Talk to me standing at the same level as me. See where I've been. Walk a mile in my shoes. And then you can tell me what to do. Then you can tell me where my home is, because this is my home and you're not taking me out of here.
Voices from the May Day protests in New York. Special thanks to Democracy Now's Tarina Nadura, John Hamilton, Andre Lewis, Ariel Boone, Ruben Gomez-Garcia. Well, meanwhile, here in North Carolina, more than 100 people braved the rain to take part in a May Day rally outside the state capitol in Raleigh to protest a series of proposed anti-worker, anti-immigrant bills. We're joined now by two guests. Raul Jimenez is an organizer with the Triangle People's Assembly, which helped organize the May Day rallies. And Sarah Gillooly is the policy director of the ACLU of North Carolina. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Raul, let's begin with you. Talk about why you were out there yesterday on May Day, your major concerns here in North Carolina.
So I was out there because there's a lot of attacks on immigrants and a lot of attacks on workers at the NC legislature and, on a national level. You have at the legislature bills like HB 113 and bills like SB 145.
Explain these.
So HB 113 is a bill that would basically create a process to create penalties for local governments that don't comply with immigration laws. So that would mean that would put an end to sanctuary cities. That means that it would also this bill would also make it so that local law enforcement can't use organization IDs, which are IDs given by organizations like nonprofits to undocumented immigrants. So that means that all undocumented immigrants will also be afraid to call 911 or to call the police in case there's a crime, or even. And
when people are afraid to call the police when they fear there's a crime, that endangers everyone.
Yes, that's correct. Because I mean, somebody breaks into your house, so there's a robber around. You can't call the police because you're afraid you're going to be deported, or the law enforcement is going to deport you or put you through the process of ICE. So you have that. Then you have State Bill 145, which basically forces the Department of Public Safety to enter into a 287G agreement. And 287G is a law that passed quite a while back that basically gives local law enforcement the right to act as immigration officers. So like in Wayne County, if you're pulled over or you're arrested, the police runs through your records and immigration system. So that.
Sarah Gillooly, can you talk about taking on these laws at the ACLU?
Yeah, so the ACLU of North Carolina has been fighting these bills in the North Carolina legislature along with our allies and partners in the immigrant rights community. As Raul was saying, Senate Bill 145 is incredibly dangerous. Not only does it create the only statewide 287G in the country, turning all highway patrol officers potentially into immigration enforcement officers.
And how do they do that?
Through entering into an agreement with the federal government. This is the 287G. This is an arrangement with the federal government, and it would effectively create highway patrol officers who are also acting as federal immigration agents.
So they would be checking your driver's license and also figure out if you're undocumented or not?
It's hard to know exactly what they would be doing under that arrangement, but certainly the intent of those programs is to make it such that highway patrol officers could be detaining people who are undocumented and transporting them into ICE custody.
Are there sanctuary cities in North Carolina?
Raul, do you want to answer that?
As far as I know, there are none actually at the moment. I think after last year, if I remember correctly, there was sort of a ban on sanctuary cities in the state of North Carolina, and so a lot of those went away. So as far as I know, there's none.
Yeah, there are none. Sanctuary cities are banned in North Carolina. They have been for over a year now. And this new law goes a step further and creates a process by which citizens can anonymously report their local government or their law enforcement agency as not enforcing immigration law, and then would create financial penalties, withhold tax revenue from any city or law enforcement agency that doesn't enforce federal immigration law.
And these are all in effect?
They are. These laws are pending in the North Carolina legislature.
Raul Jimenez, yesterday was International Workers' Day, May Day. How are workers treated? What were your main concerns?
So as somebody who comes from an immigrant background, my dad worked in the fields, I worked in the fields. The treatment is horrible when you talk about immigrant workers.
Which fields? So
North Carolina tobacco fields, sweet potato fields. As a farm worker, we were treated bad. And all farm workers across North Carolina, they live in deplorable housing. You're talking about housing that has, bed bugs and rats, not even sometimes mattresses to sleep in, holes in the wall. Their conditions are horrible, working 13, 14 hours a day in the heat in the summer, which is when the tobacco is fully grown and it needs to be harvested. And not only that, they're also not paid. Sometimes the minimum wage. Sometimes workers work for $6 an hour in the heat. They do this because they need to support their families in Mexico. They suffer through the exploitation. They suffer through the oppression because they need $6 an hour, which is ridiculous because the minimum wage federally is $7.25, and a lot of workers are not getting that.
And if they complain, they're concerned about being deported?
Correct, yeah.
What about deportations and detentions right now under the Trump administration? I mean, President Obama came to be known as, even by his immigrant rights allies, as the deporter-in-chief. He oversaw the deportations of millions of immigrants.
Yes, he did. He certainly did. We don't really applaud Obama for a lot when it comes to immigrants, and I mean when it comes to a lot of things. But since Trump's presidency, there have been a lot of deportations, a lot of people being sent to the detention centers. I couldn't tell you a number, but everywhere on the news, on Facebook, everywhere you see, people are getting detained, people are getting deported, families are being separated.
You're setting up Know Your Rights seminars around the state?
Yes, there are a lot of those going on around the state, mostly because, unfortunately, a lot of people get pulled over or go into detention centers without knowing exactly what to do. Unfortunately, a lot of people will go into a detention center and sign whatever the detention officer gives them because they don't know what they're reading or they don't know what they're supposed to do. So we want people to know their rights. We want people to know.
What are their rights? So
their rights right now are basically to remain silent, to ask for a lawyer if they need one. Well, they're obviously needing one if they're in an ICE detention center, but they also have a right to appeal any immigration, what do you call it?
When they're held.
When they're held, yes. When they're held, they have a right to appeal and to have a stay, so that way they're not in the detention center the whole time and can fight their case. Because a lot of these people are normal people like us. They're not criminals, And I think that's one of the things Trump has done really well is criminalize the immigrants, criminalize them and put fear in them, and basically their rights is to not be treated as a criminal.
And as a lawyer, Sarah, what you tell people when they're picked up in terms of what their rights are and when they're in an ICE detention facility?
Yeah, I'm not an immigration attorney, but certainly the ACLU is excited by the Know Your Rights events that are happening around the state and supporting them and making sure that people, whether they're undocumented or documented, understand that they have the right to remain silent, that they have the right to appeal, that they have the right to request an attorney, although that doesn't mean an attorney necessarily will be provided to individuals. And I think it's important to note that at the same time that these rallies were happening in North Carolina, these protests on May Day, the North Carolina General Assembly has been debating two proposals to chill those kinds of protests, to scare people away from protesting in North Carolina. One of those bills that was passed in the House last week would remove civil liability for any driver who hits a protester in the street during a protest. Another bill would have created the new crime of economic terrorism. It would have been a new felony that if you were arrested during a protest and your protest caused a business to lose more than $1,000 of business because you were, blocking the entryway or in the street, that you would be charged with a new felony of, quote, economic terrorism. More than 1,700 North Carolinians spoke out against that bill, and we defeated it. But the purpose of these bills is very clear. It's to prevent May Day protest. It's to prevent the Charlotte uprising. It's to prevent North Carolinians. It's to
explain the Charlotte uprising.
Yeah, back in September of 2016, there was a fatal police shooting of a man named Keith Scott in Charlotte, North Carolina, and people in Charlotte poured into the streets to protest, to exercise their First Amendment rights, to express their outrage, and streets were blocked during those protests. And where appropriate, certainly people were detained when they were violating public safety. But this new bill would create this crime of terrorism for people who are protesting in the street, and that's really about scaring people away from protesting.
Are you nervous, Raul? We've been going around the country. We were just in Vermont, where we saw Zuli Palacios and Kike Pakazar. They were two immigrants' rights activists who work with migrant justice in Burlington. They were arrested by ICE. They were held for 11 days. There was tremendous outcry, and so now they're out. We were just in Denver, and there Jeanette Vizquera has taken refuge, has taken sanctuary in the Unitarian Church there. She was just named one of the most 100 important people by Time magazine. The day after they had a gala in the church, because she couldn't go to the Time Gala in New York, the next morning Arturo Hernandez Garcia was picked up, who had taken refuge in the church 2 years before and had a piece of paper that said he's not a priority for deportation. When AFSC, American Friends Service Committee, called ICE and said, why did you take him? They said, we don't have priorities anymore, an odd way to put it. But Raul.
Am I scared? Yes. I have family who's undocumented, who drive around in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, which I believe is another 287G county. And so I have family here in Wake County that is undocumented. And so, yes, I'm afraid that they're going to get picked up. They're going to be deported by ICE and sent back. And my family has family. They have kids who were born here in the U.S. So, yes, I'm afraid, but that doesn't stop me from, marching and protesting in the streets and telling, Trump and the legislature, the North Carolina legislatures, that they need to stop passing these laws that affect families in North Carolina and nationwide.
Well, I wanted to end by turning to another issue, the issue of the ACLU's plans to fight the North Carolina bill that replaced the anti-trans bill known as HB 2. Sarah Gillooly, for people who don't live in North Carolina, maybe even some who do, can you give us an update on what's happened? I mean, now the Republican governor, McCrory, has been replaced by a Democratic governor, Cooper. What happened with HB 2 and what's happened with its replacement?
Well, the story that people heard about the replacement of HB 2 is HB 2 has been undone. It's been repealed. Basketball has returned. The harm has been undone. The harm of HB 2 has been undone. And while it's
Explain what you mean by basketball has returned.
Yeah, the NCAA had been boycotting North Carolina as a result of HB 2 and the blatant sort of violations and discrimination of the law. Basketball has returned, but let me be clear, HB 2 has not been repealed, and the harm of HB 2 to transgender North Carolinians has not been undone. So HB 2 did three things. It said that trans people could only use the bathroom of their biological sex in accordance with their birth certificate. It said that no city could pass a non-discrimination ordinance to protect transgender North Carolinians. And the third thing it said was only the General Assembly could regulate access to bathrooms and locker rooms. The legislature did undo that first part, and that's really important. So transgender North Carolinians are no longer prohibited from using the restroom if it doesn't comport with their birth certificate. However, the other two pieces of the law are still in place, and those two pieces of the law perpetuate the dangerous belief that transgender North Carolinians are a threat to privacy or public safety. And the ACLU has been challenging HB 2 in the court, and we will continue to challenge the new law, HB 142. We'll be amending our current complaint in court in the weeks to come and moving forward to make sure that transgender North Carolinians are protected equally under the law.
And the fact that the governor, though he says he doesn't love the new bill, calls it a compromise?
No LGBT people were at the table in discussing that compromise. No civil rights organizations were consulted in drafting that compromise. The compromise was a full and clean repeal of HB 2, and what we've been left with is a partial HB 2.
Well, we'll continue to follow this. I want to thank you both for being with us. Sarah Gillooly is with the ACLU of North Carolina, and Raul Jimenez is with the Triangle People's Assembly. Yes, we're broadcasting from Raleigh, North Carolina, as we continue our journey through the United States. We'll be tonight in Miami, and then tomorrow we're moving on to Tampa, Florida. We're on then to Atlanta, and we'll be going to Madison, Wisconsin, Chicago, and we'll be in Michigan as well. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we're going to look at the politics of North Carolina in the broadest sense. Stay with us.
No me representas, no, yo me represento hoy. Vamos a darle movimiento. En mi palabra y universo me represento yo. No me representas, no, yo me represento hoy. Vamos a darle movimiento. En mi palabra y universo. Tu virilidad no me representa, no necesito de un hombre pa' que me tomen en cuenta, porque mi voz con el viento se conecta, haciendo poesía declaro mi independencia, unión combativa que con canto me libera, palabra que con el todo lo inyecta, en la energía que fluye en el cuerpo, pensamientos ancestrales alimentan mi sustento, por eso ser parte del movimiento, que marea desafía, en canto normado desafina, en sociedad mezquina, al borde del colapso y se vecina, justicia tardía, mucho cuidado en la esquina, hija, que allá afuera la cosa está que arde, hay mucho macho bien vestido de cobarde, no, No me representas, no. Yo me represento hoy. Vamos a darle movimiento. En mi palabra y universo me represento yo. No me representas, no. Yo me represento hoy. Vamos a darle movimiento. En mi palabra y universo. Insolencia que es fuerte como roble, es atroz que el sistema nos desborde. Sálvese quien no soporte, pisotearse hizo un deporte. Sexo débil me llamaron, cara del alma también desfiguraron con cánones, regímenes inútiles, nada sutiles. Transformación te llega cuando cuerpo acepta sin mentirte ni destruirte. Por tu amor palabra vive, fuerza en tus manos, de cállate y mentirte. Labrando autonomía, llama interna que resiste. Ser mujer por su espíritu existe, sin que voz del otro me aniquile. Estreta del sistema que te vendieron y tú asumiste. Ya deja de bloquear, sentimiento natural. Ese es el cambio radical. No me representas, no.
Audrey Funk performing at Washington Square Park in New York City in celebration of May Day. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We are broadcasting from Raleigh, North Carolina. We're going to turn to look at the state of politics here in the state's capital and in the state, North Carolina. It's been nearly 6 months since voters elected Democrat Roy Cooper as governor. Republican lawmakers responded by waging what many described as a legislative coup to strip away much of Cooper's power. Meanwhile, Republicans in North Carolina are attempting to solidify their legislative power by passing a series of new laws to restrict voting rights. This comes despite report by the Electoral Integrity Project that determined that North Carolina's democratic institutions are so flawed the state should no longer be considered a functioning democracy. I'm joined here in Raleigh by Chris Crom, Executive Director of the Institute for Southern Studies, publisher of Facing South. Chris, it's great to have you back.
Welcome back to North Carolina.
Talk about what North Carolina faces today and your assessment, this report that says North Carolina is no longer a functioning democracy.
Well, it's remarkable. I think North Carolina definitely is ground zero. It's a cautionary tale about what can happen with unfettered conservative rule, but also about the possibilities of resistance. You know, if you think back historically, North Carolina was always viewed as this moderate state, but then really fueled by big money. In 2012, 2010, there was a sharp rightward turn, and you saw trifecta conservative control in the state, much like you see nationally now, so you understand what we've been going through here in North Carolina at the federal level. And really there was an outright full-scale attack on workers' rights, LGBTQ rights, voting rights, the very elements of democracy, as that report pointed out. But really there was also kind of a resistance movement that formed. We know about the Moral Monday movement. We know about the legal challenges that ended up striking down a lot of those laws. And then there was an electoral surge we saw last year where there was a Democratic governor elected. One of the most progressive attorney generals was elected. The Supreme Court is now progressive majority. And so really shows about how deeply contested North Carolina is, and I think really a bellwether for the rest of the country.
So talk about what is being described as a legislative coup against the new governor.
Well, as soon as McCrory was voted out of office, there was a special session that was held in December, and immediately the Republicans, who still had a majority in the House and the Senate, went to work with a slew of bills that were really aimed at trying to limit the control of the new governor, limiting the kind of appointments they could do, trying to change the way the election boards were set up. And it was pretty amazing just to see the full-scale attack. And they have a veto-proof majority. So for each of these bills, Governor Cooper, who was elected by a narrow margin in the last election, has been able to veto these bills, but then they have the ability to overcome those vetoes, and a lot of them are going straight to court. The Cooper administration has said they're going to legally challenge that these are overreach, that they violate the separation of powers, and that really is just an attempt, a power grab by the legislature to try to hold on to that conservative control that they enjoyed since 2012.
Explain the limiting of the governor's powers. What Governor McCrory, who signed HB 2 into law, for example, what powers he had that Governor Cooper doesn't?
Well, some of the biggest have to do with election boards. So, for example, knowing that this is going to be one of the key battlegrounds in the coming years with a deeply contested state like North Carolina, there's been a proposed complete overhaul of the whole election process. And so it used to be that the governor could appoint the chair of the Board of Elections, that there would be a 3-2 majority for who was the governor. The party in power could have a 3-2 majority. Well, now they have a new bill where it's going to be evenly divided, which of course means that they're never going to have an agreement in these election board meetings. But most critically, that Republicans at the local level will have the control on even-yeared elections. Well, of course, those are the most important elections in the entire state, and that's when the legislature is elected, Senate races, presidential races. And so really it was a full-scale power grab to try to put back the power to control the election process and democracy in the hands of the conservative-controlled legislature.
I want to turn to the president of the North Carolina NAACP, Moral Monday's leader, Reverend Dr. William Barber. He spoke to Democracy Now! Earlier this year about voting restrictions.
North Carolina has been found guilty twice on voter suppression. Last August, we won a case that said their so-called voter integrity law was a voter suppression law when they cut early voting, cut same-day registration, denied 17-year-olds the right to pre-register, and tried to pass not just photo ID that the Help America Vote Act allows, but they actually wanted to pass the worst form of photo ID, which said that in this state, even if you had a college ID or a federal ID, it still would not be considered valid.
Chris Crown. Responding to what Reverend Barber has to say and the whole issue of voting rights.
Well, North Carolina has just really been ground zero nationally for the whole voting rights struggle. And two key things happened last year. First of all, as Reverend Barber was pointing out, a court struck down key elements of this sweeping voting law that had been passed in 2013, which had voter ID, that slashed early voting days. It took away great programs like this teen pre-registration program. If you're 16, 17 years old and you wanted to learn more about politics, you could pre-register for when you did turn of age. All those got knocked down. Well, a court said that that was overreach, that was like almost surgical precision in the way that it discriminated against certain voters in the state. And so that ultimately got overturned. And a lot of those key provisions, which were considered really far-sighted reforms in North Carolina, were reinstated. The other big one that came down too was a shooting down of the legislative districts, which had been so heavily racially gerrymandered in North Carolina. And the upshot of that is that next year they're going to have to redraw the maps for at least 28 seats in the House and Senate, and that's going to affect over 50 races in the state. And so while the conservatives in power in North Carolina have been able to really engineer these lines down to a science to ensure that they could preserve conservative control, that means next year a lot of these are going to be redrawn, and a lot of them are going to be competitive again, and I think that's going to make North Carolina a very interesting state to watch in 2018.
I want to talk about North Carolina as the site in the South also of Trump support and what that means, but we're going to go to a break first. We're talking to Chris Crom, Executive Director of the Institute for Southern Studies. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We're in North Carolina. Stay with us.
Okay, my people, all the way from Guatemala, ya llegaron los nahuales. Esto es reggae cumbia para el mundo entero. Ya cayó el 20. ¿Qué es lo que dice? Ya cayó el 20. That's right. Ya cayó el 20. Everyone, ya cayó el 20. Ya cayó. Hey, yo. Babilón se está acabando. Se está acabando. Babilón se está muriendo. Eso es lo que decimos. Babilón se está acabando. Se está acabando. That's right. Babilón se está muriendo. Gua para pa gua. Okay, reggae music, we're gonna say Esto ya estalló, SR ya llegó.
That's Dr. Nativo y Los Warrior Candela performing at Washington Square Park in New York City in celebration of May Day. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the capital of North Carolina in Raleigh. We're turning now to look at the increasing power of states in the South to shape national politics. Our guest, Chris Crom, writes in his latest piece that Southern states gave 160 Electoral College votes to Trump, more than half of the 306 total he needed to become president. With this victory, Crom goes on to write, quote, Southern Republicans have emerged as key figures in the new administration and the GOP-controlled Congress, giving Southern states growing influence in shaping the nation's political agenda, he writes. Many Republicans from the South have been confirmed in senior cabinet positions, including South Carolina's Mick Mulvaney as Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Rick Perry from Texas as Energy Secretary, Alabama's Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, and the former Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson of Texas confirmed as Secretary of State. Yes, Chris Crom is still with us, Executive Director of the Institute for Southern Studies and publisher of Facing South. So talk about the leadership being drawn from the South and that significance.
Well, this is part of a larger trend. The South is rising again, for sure, in national politics. 1/3 of the Electoral College votes that it takes to be elected president in this country are in 13 southern states, and that's only going to grow. After the 2020 census, there's going to be another 5 Electoral College votes or so. They're going to come from southern states. So what it is a shifting of the gravity of political power in this country going to the South, and I think the Trump administration knows that. They know that the South, for all the attention we've put on Michigan and those battleground states, which was certainly important, it was really the fact that southern states accounted for half of his Electoral College votes that he's in the White House today. And he understands the power of Southern conservatism behind the wind in the sails of his presidency. And you see that in these key positions, especially in the Trump cabinet. You also see it in the delegation from southern states that are having a lot of influence in Congress. And I think what it adds up to is that we understand that really the South has to become contested territory, that it can't be ceded to conservative Republicans, or they're just going to be able to really up their game in using the South as a platform to drive a conservative agenda.
Are you seeing that change here in North Carolina, as you said, when you look at this latest election?
Well, absolutely. And I think North Carolina is an example, right, of these conflicting trends where on one hand, for sure, the demographics are changing. It's becoming an increasingly diverse state, growing populations, new immigrant communities, Asian American communities, one of the fastest growing Asian American communities in the country, return migration of African Americans to cities like Charlotte and Raleigh. This is really changing the makeup, this so-called new American majority. We saw the evidence of that in the last election with in the governor's race and other key races. But on the other hand, we have to be reminded about this deep white conservative trend that exists in many southern states, and that's exactly what Trump was able to activate in winning the state in 2016.
So I want to turn to your recent piece in which you profile several Trump cabinet ministers from southern states, including the head of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney of South Carolina. Let's turn to Mulvaney talking about the budget last month in an interview on MSNBC's Morning Joe. He was questioned by Willie Geist.
Can we really continue to ask a coal miner in West Virginia or a single mom in Detroit to pay for these programs? The answer was no. We can ask them to pay for defense, and we will, but we can't ask them to continue to pay for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Make no mistake about it. This is a hard power budget, not a soft power budget. That is what the president wanted, and that's what we gave him.
So, Director Mulvaney, there's in this budget a $3.7 billion cut in grants for teacher training, after-school summer programs, and aid to low-income students. What do you say to a family right now who is a low-income family and depends on this kind of money? What do you say to a teacher who's busting his or her butt every day and relies on this money? What happens to them?
A lot of those programs that we target out, they sound great, don't they? They always do. We don't put a bad name on a program. The programs are always wonderful. It's always small business or whatever. They don't work. A lot of them simply don't work. I can't justify them to the folks who are paying the taxes. I can't go to the auto worker in Ohio and say, please give me some of your money so that I can do this program over here someplace else that really isn't helping anybody. I can ask them to help pay for defense.
That was Mick Mulvaney on MSNBC. Chris Crom?
Well, I think it's just a great example. Here you have someone who's in charge of devising the budget that will fund government, who's deeply anti-government. All he can do is come up with a list of programs that he thinks are antithetical to free enterprise and the American way. He went so far as to say he couldn't justify the Meals on Wheels program, and then he had to walk that one back later. But it's just a great example of, he is deeply hostile to government programs. He was actually viewed, because he had been a member of the Freedom Caucus, that he was supposed to be a bridge to some of the other Republicans to help push through the repeal of Obamacare. That didn't work out. He wasn't able to make that coalition happen. One interesting thing is that when he was a representative from South Carolina, this anti-spending impetus he had even extended to military spending, and he sided with Democrats in opposing some weapons programs. But now that he's in the Office of Management and Budget, it's interesting that the budget that he unveiled for the Trump administration had a $50 billion increase in military spending. So I guess he's made peace with the war budget now that he's in the Trump cabinet.
And talk about Tillerson from Texas, Sessions from Alabama.
Well, it's a real cast of characters. Sessions, I think, has gotten a lot of national attention just given his checkered history on voting rights, civil rights, coming out of Alabama. One of his top aides was also a top aide to Trump, that's Sean Miller, who went to school just down the road here at Duke University. But clearly, he's being rewarded for his early support of the Trump candidacy. I don't think anybody would have picked him to be the top candidate for the Attorney General position, especially given his history of targeting African-American voting leaders in Alabama, for which Coretta Scott King famously authored that letter that Senator Warren, tried to read in the Senate when that confirmation hearing was happening. Then you think about people like Tom Price.
And she was censured.
It was blocked from being able to actually read this letter, which so eloquently laid out about why the civil rights community was so concerned about Sessions back in the 1980s. You look at characters like Tom Price coming out of Georgia, who is interesting as a doctor. He was part of this group that called Medicare and Medicaid, aspects of socialized medicine that should be vehemently opposed. And he really had a checkered record because he was known for going to bat for pharmaceutical companies, a lot of conflicts of interest where he tried to pull reports that were critical of different drugs from companies that he'd gotten money from the CEO of that company that created that heart drug. Just kind of on down the line, questions about stocks in pharmaceuticals that he was being discussed in his committees. So he really had a checkered record. I think some of those issues are going to come back to dog him as he continues in his position at Department of Health and Human Services. And then Tillerson, I think you're absolutely right. I think the most interesting one there is just given his history of conflicts, where in his position as a CEO at Exxon having interests that were really antithetical to the interest of the State Department and wanting to operate in countries where there were sanctions or other limitations, where the government was really trying to turn the screws a little bit on human rights violations, but Exxon wanting to come in and be able to do business. And it's interesting that he's going to still have that conflict as Secretary of State.
Of the 13 southern states, only Virginia voted for Hillary Clinton.
That's right.
Can you talk about what accounts for this?
Yeah, well, I think Trump was really remarkable in being able to activate. We know that the demography of these southern states is rapidly changing. We know that they're becoming more diverse, a lot of majority people of color communities across the South. But we also reminded, I think, in this last election that there's a deep well of Southern conservatism that Trump was able to effectively mobilize. And so you really saw turnout jump in a lot of states, and it was both some of the newer voters who are the future of a lot of these southern states, but also he was able to mobilize a white conservative electorate, which in many cases carried the day and allowed him to win those states.
There's a recent piece in Slate headlined, "America Could Look Like North Carolina in 2020. Yikes." Do you agree with this?
I think it's definitely, as I said earlier, a cautionary tale. It shows when there's unfettered conservative control, like we saw in North Carolina starting in 2012, just the scale of the agenda that was able to really dig into voting rights, LGBTQ rights, workers' rights, the environment, just this full-scale attack, immigrant rights, just to see how much could happen in a very short period of time with that degree of conservative control. And then on the other side, though, about the resistance and the ability to beat some of those back.
Chris, I'd like to talk about Art Pope. We just covered the People's Climate March in Washington. There was a lot of discussion about the Koch brothers and their power and the power of dark money, the influence on everything from Congress to the U.S. Supreme Court. Can you talk about Art Pope in North Carolina? When we last spoke here in Charlotte at the Democratic convention that took place, you were talking about his power. Who is this figure?
Yeah, Art Pope is a multimillionaire who over the last decade has invested about $50 million in trying to shift the agenda of the state in a more rightward direction. He's a close ally of the Koch brothers. He was actually for many years the chair of Americans for Prosperity, the national Tea Party group. He founded inherited a retail business empire that really is the basis that fuels his money and his political machine. And what's really interesting was his ability to not only fund politicians and inject money into the political process after Citizens United. So he was funding a lot of these so-called dark money groups and injecting money that really helped fuel the takeover of conservatives in the state legislature in 2010 and 2012. But then also he had a network of groups like Americans for Prosperity, think tanks, advocacy groups, and these really were the masterminds behind the attacks, for example, on voting rights. It was these places that wrote up the bills that were taking out all the protections for clean elections, that were drawing up the bills to slash early voting and drumming up concern about voter fraud. And so it was this really sophisticated network, very well funded. And when Governor McCrory, the Republican, took power in 2012, lo and behold, he appointed as his budget director, perched there in the office of the governor as budget director, Art Pope. And that really was, I think, the apex of his power and influence in the state. And one of the first things he did is defund a clean elections program that tried to drive money out of judicial races in the state. So was really able to exert his influence. So right now, with McCrory out of power, you don't see his influence as directly as you saw before. But certainly he's one of the most important state-level big money players you're going to see anywhere in the country, and his ability to shape state politics.
I'd like to turn to civil rights icon, the Democratic Congressman John Lewis from the South, from Georgia, testifying during Sessions confirmation hearings earlier this year.
It doesn't matter how Senator Sessions may smile, how friendly he may be, how he may speak to you. But we need someone who's going to stand up, and speak out for the people that need help, for people being discriminated against. And it doesn't matter whether they're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American, whether they're straight or gay, Muslim, Christian, or Jews. We all live in the same house, the American house. We need someone as Attorney General who's going to look out for all of us and not just for some of us.
So that was John Lewis speaking against the confirmation of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. Of course, he was confirmed. Your final comments.
Well, I think that's just a powerful reminder that despite how dark things look, and that when you think about the strong agenda, the right-wing agenda that we see right now, this unbroken tradition of resistance in the South that people like Representative Lewis embody at the Institute for Southern Studies. We were founded by civil rights veterans, and you just think about that unbroken history that you really see today that's able to really continue to push the South forward.
Well, Chris Crum, I want to thank you for being with us, Executive Director of the Institute for Southern Studies, publisher of Facing South. We'll link to your piece, South's Political Clout Rising Under Trump. That does it for our show. We'll be covering the story of hog farming and liquid hog manure being sprayed on largely African-American communities later on our journey. This does it for our show. As we continue our tour around the country, I'll be speaking in Miami tonight, 6:30 at the Coral Gables Congregational Church. Then on Wednesday, I'm on to Tampa at 7:30 p.m. at the Seminole Heights United Methodist Church. Thursday, it's Atlanta, 7 p.m. at the First Iconium Baptist Church. And on Friday at 2 at Colton College College in Minnesota, at 6:30 at Augsburg College in Minneapolis. On Saturday, we're on to Madison, Wisconsin in the afternoon, then Chicago in the evening. Sunday, I'm speaking in Michigan, Kalamazoo at 11, Lansing at 2, and Grand Rapids at 5:30. Monday night, I'll be speaking at Philadelphia at the Philly Free Library. Check our website for details. This is Democracy Now!, produced by Mike Burke, Dina Gester, Nermit Shea, Carla Wisler, Agostino, Sam Malkoff, John Hamilton, Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.